Thank you for your kind introduction. So, as Reggie mentioned, I have no life. I am that person that if you invite me to your party, I will take a glass of wine and walk around and try and meet new people by saying, "Hi, would you like to talk about plagiarism?" And then the person will inevitably say, "Oh, yes, absolutely. But there's just someone over there I need to go say hello to." So yes, academic integrity is one of my very special interests, and I hope that by the end of today, if it's not one of yours, it will be as well. But given the work that I do, I like to situate these talks in the context of research and scholarship. So today's talk is grounded in 3 published books, the second handbook of academic integrity, and I'll just take a little pause here before I go on to the other ones and say that this book is considered the major reference work in our field. This one was published in 2024. It includes 112 chapters from 145 contributors all over the world. It shows the latest thinking around academic integrity. 2 of those chapters were led by individuals at Brock University. So I'd just like to take a moment to give a shout out to Anne Gagné. Thank you for your chapter on accessibility, inclusion, and academic integrity, and the chapter led by Rahul Kumar on artificial intelligence and academic integrity. Then we have Academic Integrity in Canada, which is an open access book, anybody can look at it, and then Plagiarism in Higher Education, as well as some funded research around artificial intelligence and academic integrity, and some SSHRC-funded research that we also had 2 Brock collaborators on. So shout out again to Rahul Kumar and Mike Minzak from the Faculty of Education who joined us for understanding the impact of artificial intelligence on higher education. Our SOTL project at the University of Calgary is probably relevant because this is a teaching and learning event. And it goes back to the Plagiarism in Higher Ed book that I'll tell you a little bit more about later on. In about, I guess it was 2021, we started thinking about AI and our academic integrity on our campus and wanted to do some research around it. And our teaching and learning grant folks allowed us to pitch an idea. So in January of 22, we pitched a draft of a SOTL project application, and we wanted to look at AI and academic integrity. And the feedback we got from our Teaching and Learning Center in January of 2022 was, isn't this a little bit like Star Trek? Do you really think AI is going to have any place in teaching and learning in our lifetime? And we said, yes. So we did what you do when you get feedback on a grant application. We bolstered our literature review. We strengthened the argument. We got the grant. And this team was a really interesting transdisciplinary team. So I had the pleasure of leading it. I invited my colleague Bob Brennan from Mechanical Engineering and Jason from the Department of English, and then another colleague, and I'll tell you about her in just a moment. So I can tell you that Bob from engineering thought that AI was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and we should all be doing it. Jason from creative writing thought AI was heinous and needed to be stopped immediately. And then our third co-investigator was Dr. Brenda McDermott, who's the manager of Student Accessibility Services. And she came in and said, if AI tools are an adaptive or an assistive technology, are we violating students' human rights if we try to deny them access? And that stopped us all in our tracks. Because suddenly the polarized positions that were becoming entrenched in our discourse early on were disrupted by a new perspective that none of us had thought about. And from then on, we took a position of listening to each other and our different perspectives and really resisted the temptation to think that our own position was the only position. That has served us well, and with regards to academic integrity generally, I think taking a position of listening and understanding a variety of perspectives can be helpful. So that's a little bit of the work that frames today's talk. But I just wanted to set the stage a little bit because although we'll focus on academic integrity, it's a huge topic, as is artificial intelligence, and I've been told by Julia that I have a hard stop at 11. So we won't be able to cover all the topics today. We won't be able to get into many of the ethical complexities, but I wanted to pause and recognize that there are many of them. Labor issues, gender and bias issues, among others, environmental impacts. These are all important, but I'm going to stay in my lane and only talk about academic integrity today. We know that this will be part of a conversation for many years to come, and we won't solve all of the problems, but I hope we can open some new conversations. I wanted to start by sharing with you one of my pet peeves. That's when I hear someone say to me, I'm dealing with a case of academic integrity. I've got so many cases of academic integrity to manage. That pet peeve led to this work with a couple of graduate students. We put together this academic integrity continuum. I would like to say that we don't deal with integrity or manage integrity, but rather we should celebrate it and encourage it. So getting our language right is part of the basics. We put together this continuum, and at one end we have academic integrity, skill building, education, talking about ethical learning, building a community of expectations, etc. But then if you've been in this game long enough, there comes this moment, this holy crap moment in teaching and learning where you say, holy crap, a student's just cheated because I've seen the crib notes on the exam. Or I'm pretty sure something is going wrong here. This moment, this critical incident, we call it. And for instructors, there can be all kinds of reactions associated with this. From what do I do? Who do I talk to? Is there a policy? I know you have policies here at Brock. What's the process? Do I like the process? In some work I did with one of our graduate students at the University of Calgary, Paul McLeod, he did a survey with more than 400 faculty across Canada, and we found that more than 40% of faculty do not report academic misconduct. With the reasons being, if they find the policies either too lenient or too punitive, they will not report it. If they find the process too cumbersome, they won't report it. And if they feel that somehow the policy doesn't represent their ideals as an educator, they won't report it. So, thinking about 40% of faculty who don't report. We'll come back to that later. But once we pass that critical incident, we get into breaches of academic integrity or violations of integrity, or we can just call it what it is, misconduct. What we don't want to do is use politically correct language to whitewash misconduct and say we're dealing with integrity. If we're only dealing with breaches, policies, procedures, sanctions, we're not dealing with integrity, we're dealing with misconduct. So just kind of getting the language right can be helpful when we're talking to students. I want to also talk about some work done by an American author named Deborah Rohde. She has a very interesting book called Cheating. If you invite me to your next party, I'll tell you about it. So Deborah Rohde, in her book, has these different sections. She has a section on financial fraud. She has another section on intimate relationship cheating, and she has a section on academic cheating as well. And she talks about this sort of bell curve of cheating. And if you've been in this game for a while, you can sort of start to think about, okay, there's these people who do not cheat, are at this bell curve, and one end of this bell curve, right, a small portion of students. And then you've got all these other students who are cheating. And there's this idea of intentionality there, and deceit and deception. However, what we know about bell curves is that there are outliers at either end. So what Rohde showed through her research was that the students who don't cheat are a small percentage of the total population of students. Bless them. We wish all our students were like them. And at the other end of the bell curve are students who intentionally and deceitfully cheat. They are also the outliers. And in the middle is the 80 to 90% of the bell curve, the normal people. If you put those people in the wrong situation at the wrong time, they might make a decision they could regret. I am here today to tell you that despite what my husband might like to think, I am normal. I remember cheating. In grade 3, I copied from the Encyclopedia Britannica. I still remember it. I didn't get caught. Should I have failed grade 3? That's a debate we can have over lunch. But if we think of the bell curve of normal, and 80 to 90% of people make a misstep, cut corners, occasionally do things they're not supposed to do, then that means that there are people in this room, right here, who have engaged in cheating. Welcome to our club. But that does not mean that we in any way have any kind of pathology behind us, people who consistently and without remorse cheat again and again and again, because the serial cheaters are the outliers. So when I ask you to show up for students, I'm asking you to show up for the 80%, the normal people. The ones who never cheat don't need our help with academic integrity. But for the most part, the students that we're serving are the normal students, and we can do our work for them. So also I wanted to frame this, there can be this discord of all of these cheating students. And so to think about this and think about the biases that we bring to our work. And I'll talk a little bit more about biases later on. Often academic integrity is situated as a series of values. The International Center for Academic Integrity promotes these. This can be a useful and positive framing to have a productive conversation with students. The values that they articulate are courage, fairness, honesty, respect, responsibility, and trust. These are not necessarily universal values. We know that students may have different interpretations of these, but it can be a great starting place to have a conversation with students about what does ethical learning mean to you? And the other side of that, what does ethical teaching mean to you? And have students add to this, add their own values, etc. So this is a good framework to have these kind of conversations with students. But a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to work with a colleague from the U.S., Teddy Fishman was her name. We ended up talking about the differences between academic integrity in Canada and academic integrity in the United States. It might surprise you to know that there were polarized positions in the United States. There are sort of two schools of thought around academic integrity there that Teddy and I sort of disentangled. One was around values and morality, steeped in the framing of character education, which was later taken out of the curriculum, but continues to persist. If we can only teach the students to be good people, then they won't commit academic integrity. Remember the bell curve of normal. And so the values and morality framing from the International Center is espoused by many of these colleagues. Sort of started by one person in particular. His name was Don McCabe. He's passed away now. He was a business professor at Rutgers. He co-founded the International Center for Academic Integrity, and many people have worked there since, including some others who've done scholarship here on the screen. There's another group of people, mostly compositionists, who say, no, academic integrity has nothing to do with morality. This is an academic literacies issue. And if we help students build their skills, we can help them achieve academically. A premise here being, you can plagiarize and still be a good person. So that is sort of espoused by Rebecca Moore-Howard and her colleagues. Interestingly, Howard worked in New Jersey. McCabe worked in New York at the same time, and the two of them never spoke. They never worked together. They never had conversations. They never collaborated or debated. This was according to a conversation I had with Rebecca Moore-Howard. So it was interesting for me, this polarization. So let me ask you, where do you sit? Do you think that academic integrity is a morality issue, or is it a skills development issue? I can tell you that often when I talk with Canadians, they're kind of like, yeah, we're more centrist. Depends on the situation. I can see this or I could see that. So we sort of have our own Canadian flavor for academic integrity that might not reflect values or positions elsewhere. This was a really interesting idea for me because not all positions on academic integrity are the same. And there's more than one way to look at this, and understanding, as we did in our SOTL project, that different positions can have different strengths and contribute different things to a conversation. And a couple of years ago at the University of Calgary, a project led by Kita Gladue is worth mentioning. Kita finds her roots in the Sucker Creek Cree Nation and the Métis Nation of the Red River. And she did a project on our campus called Indigenous Academic Integrity, developed in consultation with community, and came up with principles that could reflect the values of Indigenous communities on our campus. She created this original iconography and drew from Indigenous scholars. She identified three principles. The relationality represented by a braid. I am, because you are, drawing on Smith's work, or Sean Wilson's work, rather. And that relationships do not merely shape reality, they are reality. And leading into reciprocity, drawing from Hart's work, and inherent in the roles we serve, and inherent in this commitment to the people is the understanding of the reciprocity of life and accountability to one another. The accountability to one another, not only this generation, but also future generations. And then finally, respect, defined differently from the International Center for Academic Integrity, who defines it as respect for the rules, respect for teachers, respect for authority, but rather respect for one another and nothing about us without us. Drawing here from Smith's work, Indigenous knowledge extends beyond the environment. However, it has values and principles about human behavior and ethics, about relationships and wellness and leading a good life. Knowledge has beauty and can make the world beautiful if used in a good way. What a fabulous framing of academic integrity, to focus on relationality, respect, and reciprocity, and thinking about knowledge as having beauty. These diamonds here are meant to indicate patches on a blanket. So thinking about relationality, reciprocity, and respect as a foundation, as a Canadian framing of academic integrity can help us as we evolve our understanding. So I mentioned plagiarism in higher education. This was a book that was due to the publisher in May of 2020. You might remember that time, COVID time. I think you mentioned the before times. Well, that was the during time. So in May of 2020, I had to submit this book to the publisher. And I was thinking about plagiarism at the time, inspired in part by an article written in the University Affairs by Mike Ninzak and others who were looking at artificial intelligence at the time. So plagiarism starts with a bit of history. I won't go into too much of that today. Plagiarism today, and then plagiarism of the future. And I'll talk about the plagiarism of the future today. And Julie's got, you have a copy of this for your Teaching and Learning Center now. So this is sort of the crux of what I'll talk about today. But I also wanted to talk about plagiarism and technology. There have been now, in my opinion, based on the scholarship I've done, 3 major technological impacts for plagiarism. One, of course, was the printing press. And earlier today, I was talking with classics instructor about a book written by plagiarism in 1989 by Thomas Mellon. And he said that back in the days of the printing press, plagiarism wasn't meant with, if I remember his rules, his language, he says, it wasn't meant with litigation, but rather with laughter. If you plagiarized, you are ridiculed for not having the ability to come up with your own ideas. People mocked you and you were scorned. That was your punishment for plagiarizing. But then came copyright laws about a century later. Then we started punishing people for plagiarism. So the idea of plagiarism and the punishments and our reactions for it changing over time really sort of took root in education during the Industrial Revolution. Okay, we don't need a history on the history of education here, but thinking about the earliest and first massification of education, this was the time that we laid the foundations for student conduct. If you do something wrong, you get a punishment. It was very clear. And if you plagiarize, then there's a sanction with it. Much of what we still do in student affairs today continues to have its roots in the Industrial Revolution. And although we've moved away from that in teaching and learning, we haven't really done much to update our approaches to student conduct. We still largely have a crime and punishment approach which has its roots back in this history, at least in the Western world, for academic misconduct. And then we had the internet. So this was the time I started teaching about 30 years ago when the internet was popularized, right? We had faster, more efficient research, mobilization of knowledge, and also faster and more efficient plagiarism. If you are not as old as I am, you may not know that the term cut and paste plagiarism didn't exist before the internet, because people like me had to hand copy from the Encyclopedia Britannica. So technology changes how we learn, how we write, how we interact with each other. And it was about 30 years ago that scholars started talking about this academic integrity arms race, which is still alive and well today. So let me walk you through this framework. I'll use the example of the internet because that was my first experience with this, but we could substitute in artificial intelligence here. At the top, we have a new technology that enters the scene, say the internet. There's excitement, there's confusion, there's polarized opinions, as there was with our SOTO project, eagerness, resistance, all kinds of reactions. And then we're starting to try and figure out how do we tackle this new technology for teaching and learning. We start to incorporate it into our pedagogy, our assessment, as we are trying to figure out how to use it for teaching and learning. Our students are also experimenting. It's a time of great experimentation and a high learning curve. I heard someone say the other day that 99% of us are first generation users of AI, that we are learning AI along with our students. So at the same time, people are also learning how to use the new technology to be mischievous and to cheat, not just for academics, but for everything. But then in education, enter the anti-cheating technology companies who come and tell us that they have the promise that will solve all of our problems in the form of a technology that only if we license it can we solve the problem of misconduct. So I refrain from mentioning particular companies in these talks, but colloquially, this might be known as a plagiarism detection software, or an AI text detection software, right? And the companies will have huge licenses, hundreds of thousands of dollars at universities. In some countries, they hook up with the ministries of education, and those are multi-million-dollar contracts per year, right? And with promises of solving the cheating problem. Well, the research has shown that the misconduct rates have maintained pretty much consistently over the decades, even with this so-called anti-cheating technology. In part because our students are very smart and very creative. And as fast as a company will come in and tell us that they have a technology to catch the cheaters, students will find hacks and workarounds and post them on social media channels, YouTube, Reddit, any kind of billboards, a discussion board. Wow, I'm really dating myself when I say that. All right. And they'll share their ideas on how to find hacks and workarounds. There are lots of hacks and workarounds for plagiarism detection software, online proctoring software, so-called AI text detection software. We've seen this academic integrity arms race now repeat again and again and again. And I can tell you, there are no winners in an academic integrity arms race. Or perhaps better said, there are no teaching and learning winners. The winners, of course, are the companies that peddle their licenses to us with promises that they can't keep, because ultimately it does not do what they say it can do and reduce the amount of cheating that we have. So I often say to institutions, if you are considering licensing any such product, please instead invest in your people, invest in more teaching and learning folks, for example. Because the promise of academic cheating detection software will always fail. Because cheating is not a technology problem, it is a human one. And that bell curve of normal has been persistent across generations and across countries. So thinking about what needs to be prosecuted, does every case need a full-on investigation? Are there possibilities for teaching moments, education, and the skills development and academic literacy that might help our students succeed? So often higher ed remains an opaque and mysterious place, particularly for first-generation students, for example, who come to our campuses, or those who may not have previous learning experiences in Canada, as one example. And it's all a mystery. And we can help those students unpack that mystery and take a learning approach that will help them succeed. So going back to plagiarism in higher ed. At the end of this book, I looked at the future of plagiarism. And I mentioned before one of the skills development scholars by the name of Rebecca Moore-Howard. In her work, Becky Howard talks about throwing plagiarism definitions out of our policies. She has an article that says, "Don't police, just teach." And that article, I think, is from like 30 years ago, maybe more. And so I started playing with Becky's ideas. Don't worry about all the words on the screen. I'll unpack it for you one by one. This is just an infographic that I shared a couple of years ago, and it's open access. You can look at it later on if you want. But I started thinking about Becky's ideas and thinking, well, I don't think actually we're going to throw out definitions of plagiarism from our policies anytime soon. So what do we do? And I couldn't come up with an answer. So I thought instead about, like, what happens if we transcend it? What does that look like? And the idea of a post-plagiarism world in the age of artificial intelligence came to me. Knowing how our ideas and reactions to plagiarism have changed over time, and how plagiarism itself has changed with the internet. For example, cut and paste plagiarism not existing before the popularization of the internet. So I'll walk you through post-plagiarism, and then you can see what you think about it. So this was a couple of years ago, and I've been playing with the ideas ever since. First I'll define it for you. The idea of an era in which human society and artificial intelligence is part of everyday life, including how we teach and learn and interact daily, everyday life. I'll come back to this at the end. By the way, I forgot to mention, if I can finish on time, as Julie's asked, there might be a quiz, so I hope you've been taking notes. I should have told you about the quiz at the beginning. So, artificial intelligence is part of everyday life. I make sure the quiz won't include anything before. Well, we'll see. Anyway, interact daily, everyday life. So, let's think about that. So let's go through these 6 tenets of a post-plagiarism world. Thinking about a world in which human, AI, hybrid writing would become normal. A couple of years ago when I put this infographic out there in 2023, this was February, people were still thinking about, what? How could AI and humans write together? What would that look like? Since then, we've seen books come out on co-intelligence, lots of things around co-creation with AI, and we know now that in the early days, people were just using, say, text from ChatGPT and submitting it themselves, just without any changes. But and you'll hear me use ChatGPT as kind of a generic term, right? And I'm talking about large language models like Claude, and I'm using kind of a ubiquitous way. But we know that the outputs can be remixed, reused, edited, such that by the end product is neither fully written by an AI nor fully written by a human. And trying to sort of detect where does the human writing begin and where does the AI writing begin sort of becomes futile, because the writer themselves may not know at the end by the time they've finished with the piece of writing. So trying to detect it becomes a little bit futile. The idea of us working with AI. So I don't know about you, but we are at Microsoft campus, and very quietly last September, without really telling anyone, our IT department simply flipped the switch on Microsoft Copilot. And it suddenly became available to our 45,000 students and 4,000 members of our campus. Finally, in February, we got an email from IT saying, oh, by the way, we've launched Copilot, whereas savvy students had already been using it for months. So when technologies, and Google Gemini also has a similar product, so whether you're a Google campus or a Microsoft campus, AI is already being integrated into our office technologies. So thinking about this as someone with a humanities background, my first 2 degrees were in literature, I thought a lot about its impact to creativity and writing. I'm thinking about creativity being threatened, and dug into a little bit of the work around creativity. And there's no evidence, really, empirical evidence, to suggest that our ability to be creative is compromised by artificial intelligence. It could be enhanced. We could find new ways of creating things. Some of the ed tech folks out there will give an analogy of the camera as a technology that changed creativity for forever, and how it was rejected or contested by painters. And thinking of that as one analogy. There are no perfect analogies with this, but our ability as humans to inspire each other and be inspired by one another remains exhaustible and boundless. And we can continue to use our human creativity to be the best versions of ourselves in exciting ways. Having said that, I wanted to take a little pause and say I recognize that those who make their living from creative enterprises may have their livelihood compromised. And that is an important ethical debate, one of the ones we won't be able to get into today. But thinking about decoupling human ability to be creative from a creative career. Those are separate but interconnected things, but our ability to be creative as human remains one of the things that makes us human. And thinking about the idea that AI can help us overcome language barriers. So I mentioned earlier when our teaching and learning grants team thought that our grant application was a little bit like Star Trek, right? So I confess here that as a child I was influenced by Star Trek. It was my dad's favorite TV show, so he sort of plunked me down in front of the TV, and said, here, watch this. So the idea of a universal translator had been with me for a long time, like since before I could walk. But thinking about the ways that our language barriers could be overcome. When I first produced this infographic, it got a little bit of pushback for the words that I used, and they could have been better refined. So I wanted to recognize that when I said that one's first language would begin to matter less and less as tools became available for humans to understand each other in countless languages, I wasn't trying to say that one's mother tongue would become unimportant, but rather that the barriers that divide us could be overcome by AI. So thinking about the possibilities on this side of the infographic then leads us over to sort of an ugly side, if you will, around misconduct. And a key thing here for academic integrity is this, and misconduct of all kinds, is that as humans, we can relinquish control, if we want to, an AI app to do our work for us in whole or in part, but what we don't relinquish is responsibility. We continue to be responsible for the outputs that we submit, students to professors, or employees to bosses, and that we can and must remain accountable for fact-checking, verification procedures, and truth-telling. And we're also responsible as a community for how the AI tools are developed. So when we talk about academic integrity, we can go back to values like responsibility, that are espoused in values frameworks around this, and students continue to be responsible. And at the same time, thinking about the juxtaposition of the AI as a co-creator for today and going forward. And thinking about attribution remaining important. So sometimes when people find out I'm a plagiarism scholar, they're surprised when I say things like, I couldn't give a flying leap about APA. I don't care about the technical minutiae of citing and referencing. I don't care if it's title case or sentence case capitalization, or if it's one space or two after a period. Right? I don't care. I know there's also been things in social media, by the way, of telltale things about ChatGPT, like if students use the M dash, it's a telltale sign that students have used ChatGPT. Wrong. I can say, having a background in humanities, like the Oxford comma, you can pry the M dash out of my cold, dead hands. But the idea of attribution is acknowledging who we learned from, how we know what we know, and on whose shoulders do we stand, and getting excited about this. And I think that there will be ways to connect this as well to our priorities around decolonization. If we focus less on technical minutiae and more on attribution, we can also highlight decolonization in our work. So attribution continues to remain important. But at the crux of it all, our historical definitions of plagiarism may require a rethink. In the same way that cut and paste plagiarism was a new term with the internet, we are now entering an era when this idea of plagiarism as simply ripping off somebody else's words in such a way that we can find original source material is being challenged, because whatever databases large language models are pulling from, we don't know what the source of that is. So the idea of transcending into a post-plagiarism world is, I think, where we are. Unfortunately, I don't have all the answers for you today on how we're going to fix it. But thinking about the ways that we can transcend and update our ideas around academic integrity, this is the time to do it, because historical definitions of plagiarism and misconduct may require at least questioning and reconsideration. And I wanted to kind of turn now to one of the research projects that I did, because it'll frame an important part of our conversation that comes up next. Before ChatGPT came on the scene, I worked with teams across Canada to go through policies for academic misconduct across our country. We looked at 96 institutions for colleges and universities, and we read through every single academic misconduct policy of each of those institutions in detail, and I think Brock was included in there at the time. We started first with Ontario colleges, then Ontario universities, Western Canada universities, Atlantic Canadian universities, and then finally Western Canada colleges. By the time we got to the end, this was an unfunded project. ChatGPT was on the scene, and we knew that the policies had been updated and were changing. So we looked at 160 documents, read them all manually, and sort of classified and coded what we found in them. I'm going to distill down our results in a way that will hopefully make you make sense. And if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this, it's what we found in our analysis of our policies across Canada. There's basically three ways that we deal with academic misconduct. One is a punitive method. It's crime and punishment approach. This is not new to any of us. It will be familiar because it's the thing that we experienced growing up, most of us, right? That sanctions should be fair and fit the offense. There's a progressive discipline model, meaning if it's a first offense, it's a minor punishment. If it's a second or subsequent offense, it's more serious punishments, until you get harsher and harsher penalties, and the ultimate penalty for numerous academic misconduct is expulsion or suspension. It's called exclusion in some places. It's pretty easy to monitor and track. We've got lots of universities do reports around this. This should sound very familiar to you. Then many universities will also, and colleges will layer on an educative approach where if there's an opportunity to take rehabilitative or remedial workshops afterwards to help students learn citing and referencing, paraphrasing, etc., students can learn them. It seeks to reduce repeat offenses. It's pretty easy to track. We know how many students go into those workshops. This is pretty common across Canada. But there were a couple of beautiful outliers that I think are worth mentioning. Universities that considered restorative resolutions to academic and other forms of misconduct, an approach that seeks to repair harm in the community, considers our students and teachers and administrators as part of a community building, a part of a community that requires building and long-term relationship development. The approach can be time-intensive, it is expensive, and that all parties need to agree to the approach. Thinking back to the bell curve of normal, those outliers, the serial cheaters, this might not work for those cases. Because to have a restorative resolution, the individual must be willing to take responsibility for their actions and be willing to repair harm. In an academic misconduct, you might think, who's harmed? This often shows up in the literature. Well, the teacher may feel harmed. If you remember our continuum, the teacher may feel uncertainty. They may feel, should I report this? What happens to my job if I'm precariously employed and I report this? What happens to my tenure and promotion application if I'm identified by my department head as a troublemaker? Those kinds of things are real. So thinking about that harm in that sense, students in a class might also feel harmed. I work hard to do my work honestly, but you cheated. So why should you get away with the same grade? So thinking of it from a community perspective can be helpful. Another way we might think of this is that this punitive approach, remember thinking about things that were rooted in the Industrial Revolution? This approach of the punitive approach is rooted. This is the most colonial approach to academic misconduct, whereas the restorative might be the most decolonized approach to academic misconduct. So a question I have for you is, if we say that we care about decolonizing and indigenizing our campuses, and we are not looking at decolonizing academic misconduct and other forms of student misconduct, what are we waiting for? This is one conversation I'll invite you to have on your campus. Because if you haven't already started to actively consider the ways in which restorative resolutions might be helpful, now is the time to do that. A little bit here, going back, I mentioned, I'd say a little bit more about equity. I wanted to kind of settle into one of the most taboo topics that I find in my work, which is sort of myths around who cheats. And specifically, I wanted to take a moment to talk about international students, however that might be defined. In Canada, we know that international students are a particular group of students here on a study permit. And there's a fair amount of, I guess, prevailing wisdom, whatever that might be, that international students cheat more. The research, we have very little research on in Canada from this, by the way, so what we know comes from elsewhere. Massive study done by Brechthag and colleagues in Australia with 14,000 students, self-report survey, so limited. They found that international and domestic students in Australia cheated at about the same rates. International and domestic students cheated at about the same rates. And then some research done by some U.S. colleagues said that international students were 5 times more likely to get reported for cheating. So we need to differentiate between who cheats and who gets reported for cheating, because those are different groups. Remember that thing, the statistic that Paul McLeod and I found in our paper, 40% of staff, academic staff, don't report cheating? So who reports cheating? And who are they reporting? Who are we reporting? We can layer on another piece of that looks at gender rates. So gender rates around misconduct. So the research that I've seen that's been done so far has only addressed binary genders. I haven't seen anything that's more inclusive on that yet. But the rates of misconduct between men and women show that historically, in the first half of the 20th century, research showed that men cheated more than women. Well, that was interesting. And then around the 1950s, they found more and more women cheating. Why? Well, that's about the time they started to let us into university. So when you let groups into university, demographic groups, you find that they cheat more because you've let them in. But yet men were more likely to be reported for cheating. So we can start to build a picture here based on this evidence that if you are a man and if you are a person of color and you are born elsewhere, you are much more likely to get reported for cheating than if you look like me and sound like me, a native speaker of English born in this country who's a woman. So who gets reported and who gets forgiven without ever being reported? These are important questions for which we may not have answers, but can help to inform our approaches to academic integrity. And we use this term of international students and cheating as kind of a proxy for cheating students, when what we mean is we're othering students that might not look like a dominant cultural majority. Mary Davis in the UK found that students who were disproportionately reported, so in other words, an overrepresentation in the misconduct reporting data, were racialized minority students, that's her language, from Asia and Africa. She identified 3 top countries in each region. So if you were a student from India, Pakistan, or China, from Asia, you were more likely to get reported. If you were a student from Nigeria, Africa, or Kenya, you were among the most reported students, or most reported for academic misconduct. So who's getting surveilled? Who's getting noticed? And who's really good at cheating the system? Again, important questions for us to ask. Beasley and Sachs in the United States brought up an important point that I think is worth sharing here, that the impact on international students is something that has largely not been documented or discussed. They found in their research that international students were less likely to be retained than domestic students following a finding of academic misconduct. And I kind of sat with this language. This was their language. Less likely to be retained. What does that mean? Well, we know what it means. We know that it's a requirement to withdraw, it's a suspension, it's an expulsion, and in the worst case scenario, it's a death by suicide. These are difficult things for us to talk about and to track. If you are going to update your academic misconduct policies and processes, one thing I would encourage you to do is track the students who are alleged to have engaged in misconduct or reported for misconduct, how many of them actually finish their programs. That is something easy that we can track, and we can start to understand the impact on students. We know that there can be a mental health impact, but we don't have much data on it in Canada. So when I think about post-plagiarism, I think about dismantling harmful and punitive approaches to teaching, learning, and assessment and cheating, and replacing it with an academic integrity framing that is holistic and humane. In the age of artificial intelligence, our humanity is more important than ever. I'll talk about a wraparound approach to academic integrity as a kind of framing to help us as we move into the next part of our conference here. Historically, we've had pretty antagonistic relationships with our students. Remember, the students who cheat and then the teachers who catch them. But what if we kept students at the heart of what we do, still holding them accountable for the behavior? They're still responsible, because being responsible still matters in an age of AI. But in terms of the educators, that our responsibility as educators doesn't start with cheating them on what we think something has gone wrong, but rather starts with our assessment design, the way that we're bringing our courses together, the way that we treat students in our classroom, the way that we might surveil them and be aware of our own biases. In terms of the administration, thank you for the administrators for being here. Knowing that we have clear policies and procedures, I know you do a very good job of this at Brock, and leading by example, but also bringing in other institutional priorities like decolonization and understanding the connections between institutional priorities such as that and academic integrity and misconduct. Our professional staff do the lion's share of the work in many cases for quality assurance, appeals, managing documents, etc., and provide additional support for learning. And more in my field, we're starting to make connections between academic integrity and professional ethics. So things like, I understand now the Engineering Association Board of Canada now requires engineering programs to have some attentiveness to academic integrity in its programming to maintain quality assurance. I see somebody nodding at the back. What if the Nursing Professional Association did that, and the Social Work Professional Association, and even in my field, in education? Professional associations understanding academic integrity as a foundation for professional conduct. So a key message here is that all of us have a role to play, and that role doesn't start when we think there's been a misconduct. It starts before students even come to our campus. So I'm just about at the end now, but I'll end with a call to action to get our priorities in a post-plagiarism age straight. One is we can prioritize compassion for our students as human beings over content, understanding that the majority of our students are not deliberate, deceitful cheaters. They are here to learn, and we are here to help them do that. And we can prioritize, for example, decency and dignity over deadlines. So I'll give you an example. In the UN Declaration on Human Rights, the word dignity is mentioned no less than 6 times. To what extent do human rights policies inform our academic integrity policies? And I used to be one of the most militant people that you could have ever met for deadlines with my students. I would say, when you get in the real world, your boss is going to want you to adhere to deadlines. And then I would go and ask my editor for an extension. So I started to realize the double standard that I had with my students. And now I say to my students, if you feel like you're on the brink of making a poor decision, then come and talk to me and we can figure it out together. And through my career as an educator, I have also become more attentive and better educated about my neurodiverse students and, for example, how time management can be understood differently. And I've become more compassionate as I've increased my own learning around that. So our learning as educators doesn't stop. And finally, we can prioritize pedagogy over punishment. So these are the 3 priorities that I will leave you with today. But I promised you a quiz. So before you go on to your next session, I'm going to ask you if there's one quiz question. If you know the answer, please put up your hand, but don't say the answer. Maybe I'll call on someone with their hand up. During the course of my presentation, something has changed. Do you know what it was? It's not a trick question. Okay, Rahul, because I gave you the answer this morning. Put your hand up. Okay. Okay, we've got a couple hands up here. Any other hands? Did you want to try? Okay. Anything else? Right. Thank you. You got the correct answer. You get a gold star. During the course of this presentation, I put on my artificially intelligence-enabled glasses. Could you tell? They have a built-in teleprompter. They also have a little place here where with my phone I can upload a little note, and in this part of the screen it says, this is where the crib notes for the exam go. Could you have tell if I had been in your exam hall with this? Let me complicate this even further. This particular brand of glasses, they're the Even Realities G1 glasses. They come in single vision prescription. Now, I am well past that stage of life, so I'm just going to put on my own glasses. Okay, that's much better. Okay, so these glasses come with single vision prescription possibilities. Now, imagine you have a student come into your class, and this is their prescription glasses. How can we take away medically prescribed devices from our students if this was their only pair of glasses and it's AI enabled? And if you couldn't tell this was AI enabled, now's the time to start figuring out and asking ourselves questions about this, because I would like to say that we cannot ban medically prescribed devices or glasses. I guess that's what you call them. The same thing can happen with hearing aids. Artificial intelligence, I promise you that in a post-plagiarism world, artificial intelligence was becoming more and more part of our everyday lives. And here they are. So if you couldn't tell that I was wearing AI-enabled glasses, now you know. I'll have them throughout the conference if you want to try them for yourself and see what they're like. And I will say, before I close, that these glasses, I bought them in March of 2025. Less than a month later, I saw a great TED Talk, and it's worth the 16 minutes of your life. We don't have time to play it today. And it's called Your Next Computer is Your Glasses. Because Google is coming out with a better version of these with full color, full maps, everything. The intranet is in Google's prototype of their glasses. So I will leave you with that and just say we have entered our post-plagiarism age. Enjoy the rest of your conference.